This is episode 5 of my DIY killer home cinema build. I'm going to take you through all about the riser in this episode. For some reason, it's one of my favorite parts of the room, the construction for it. Now, this covers over a large amount of time. Let's start with a quick time lapse so you can catch up on what the room looks like start to finish. And the riser build started on day 16 and it went all the way through to day 161. So again, this is lapsed time, not how many days it took to build it, but it took months and months where this work is happening over across. So we start off with the RISER U-boats, which we use to put under the floor joists. And we're trying to get some separation here between the structure of the riser and it not coming into direct contact where there could be any sort of reverberation or rattling or any sort of movement onto the concrete floor. And it also might help with covering off if the floor is not completely flat. So I'm using a plan here. I researched a couple. We've got a sort of basic one here, but then I moved over to the RISER design and I liked that more, but it just is not tall enough because I need it to be the height really of 2 floor joists because I'm going up to 400 mil high because that's going to give my sight lines enough space so you can see the bottom of the screen without seeing the top of the person's head in front of you. So I'm using the design of having 2 levels high of floor joists, but also having insulation in it and the layers of the flooring with a mass-loaded vinyl layer in between it. So here we've laid out the room, put the floor joist down, it's all in position and it's all sitting on the U-boats. I think from memory I had 50 U-boats, so pretty much just spaced them all out so we use the whole lot over the size of the riser. And coming into the room here, you can see there's like a step down where onto the concrete floor it's really 1 step and onto the top of the riser it's going to be really 2 steps. So the stairwell coming down comes in at the same level as the first step. So we've built that platform into the room and then you'll have 1 step down to then access the front row seats or 1 step up to go to the back row seats. I think that worked out pretty well. Now we've got the double height here, so we've got the floor joists with those cross sections going and you can now see the final height that it's going to come up to, especially where it meets that back door into the AV room. And that's obviously why we didn't cut that lower in the last video. Now we're back to the stage where the sound check material is on the wall and we've acoustically sealed it. And that's where the step transitions. So you go up to the bulk of the riser. And the important thing about doing the riser is that when you walk on it, you do not want to hear any foot echo. So you don't want to have anything where you're actually hearing someone walk across kind of like a hollow wooden platform. It should sound like it's just a completely dead sound. And that's exactly the result we ended up getting in the room. And there was a lot of DIY solutioning going on when we're building the riser, just because we've got to make everything transition. It's got to transition from the entry into the room. It's got to transition with a step section up onto the platform. And it then needs to transition into the back area where the flooring into the AV room still needs to stay at that same height. So there's a lot of sections that need to meet each other, but also have the step-offs so we've got the right framing to be able to then do all of the different step insets where we're going up or down. This stage in the room, we've also got pre-wire going on. So that's a video for later on where I'll cover all the pre-wire, but we have been running that at the same time that we're building the riser. And you see more of that baffle wall where the insulation is being all built out through the back of it. The area going into the AV room was really tricky because it's got to transition to stay at the same level of the top of the riser. There's that stairwell where I kind of want to maximize having some sort of storage right up to the bottom of the stairs, but also I'm planning on having the rack going above where that area where the drain is, but we're also going to have a hatch over that, so if we ever need to get to it, I move the rack out and you cut the carpet and then you can lift up the hatch. You got the bulkhead being done at that time and all the wire for the downlights in particular has been what's been done here, as well as any power to GPOs for PowerPoints. In this video you can quickly see where I've marked out the Atmos speaker locations. And again, we're just doing this at the same time before anything gets closed up so that I know that I've measured out and got everything into the right layout and I can see where the locations of any downlights or anything else that might be wiring wise in the way. There's that drain that runs across the ceiling going into the kitchen. We're going to cover that later on in mass loaded vinyl so that there's no sound whatsoever that can come from running water to be heard inside the room, and that worked very well. The baffle wall there, we reused the insulation that the builder put into the rear wall. When we pulled that all apart, we then stuffed it back behind the baffle wall. So it was just another way to reuse it, where it was going to be behind another layer of where the speakers were, but not actually in the core part of the room. The view down onto the riser, it's a simple construction really, but just getting all the layout so that all the spacing of how much weight, because it's going to have 3 cinema chairs on that back row, it's going to have to support that, as well as having things like the electrical floor box mounted into place, and also the power mounted on the front face of it for the front row seats. The riser is going to be using OSB for the layers instead of ply. I want it to be dead flat, and that's really kind of the best material we could use for that space. We're going to use green glue in it. So green glue is going to be between several of the layers. So we started with the section that transitions from the stairwell and getting the OSB onto there. And you can see there the GPO power has got a first fix done on the front face of the riser section. There's supports for where the steps are going to be. And for the first time, I'm now putting insulation. You can see the floor box is now installed at the back here. The first row of insulation is in the front section. And you can see I've got a green draw line, which I'm going to use later on for pulling a speaker cable through. That is also going to be something that didn't work out. So whilst the riser is still under construction, but the pre-wire is also being done so that we can work through and have that power going into the floor box from the feed in the back of the room. You can see that green draw line there. Insulation is now about 2/3 of the way done. And you can see here the green string line that I'm using, which is going to be how the insulation is held up in place. And there's 2 layers of insulation I'm using. So after the bottom layer of insulation has been installed, I've then left about 1 inch before putting more of the string line through, and the insulation for the second section is going to sit on top of that with this air gap in between it. And then just using the staple gun to install that string line in a zigzag pattern. And pretty much the insulation and the riser, I did all that myself. I definitely got into the insulation part of the job. And then you see when I've got the top layer of insulation going in, there's still another inch or so, maybe even a fraction more, of space above that before where the actual OSB is going to sit. Again, it's another thing for air gap to keep that designed so that there's layers of the insulation, but also layers of air for free movement before it hopefully gets absorbed. I didn't use a specific plan from anyone else for this section. I used ideas and concepts from a few that I'd definitely seen, and for people that were really trying to absorb a lot of bass, and then I just modified it for the height that I was working with, and for being able to try to get as much insulation in there into that design as well. And while the insulation goes all the way to the wall, you can also see here I've marked out the vent locations, and that's where I'm going to be putting some vents around the sides and the rear of the room. Again, hopefully just to sort of absorb and have a path for some of that bass to travel through. There's that green string line. It's actually just clothesline cord I used for that. And in this image, you can actually see there's a red line that's sort of extending across up that image along with the green draw line. And the red line here is actually because I decided I actually wanted to put 2 draw lines in there. So I put the red line and then the green line. I think I was worried that the red line wasn't going to be strong enough, and if I pulled on it, it wasn't going to have the force to be able to go through where it's actually snaking its way around things. I didn't want it to get caught anywhere. And I'll also cut a pathway so that can feed its way back into the AV room, where it can then be tucked into the corner back to the rack. That was a really satisfying feeling of getting all that insulation where it was on the home stretch of it. It had been done in most of the rest of the room, so this was the last core phase of that, especially when we can then put the top layers of OSB on it and have a solid surface to walk on again. All the pre-wire cabling is all buried everywhere it needs to be, and the floor box is in its position, so we can then do a final cutout and mark out for the boards that are going to surround it. into, and this is under the step when you first walk into the room. The mineral wall, rock wall, is going to be under all of the whole riser section as well. And that's where it's really going to absorb any sound of walking over it. You can't hear anything. And before we put on the next layer, we put green glue around everywhere. And if you don't know the green glue product, it's really for making sure that there's always some ability for those materials to move just the slightest bit so that it's not transferring sound directly through. It's always got a bit to absorb and to take that energy and transfer it through the green glue, which always stays a little bit flexible, I guess. And here we're dropping in the second layer of OSB on top of the stair landing. And the little box area being cut out here is for the electrical floor box. Now, I changed my original design here so that I'd really just have one floor box in a location and all the power just running in for the back 3 seats into that one box rather than having 3 separate power areas, which would have been in my very first design. I think you've got to change and evolve your design as you go, as you find better ideas and or things that maybe aren't working quite well, is difficult to implement, and you just got to keep being ready to adjust it as you go. So at this stage, I did actually have the floor box, so we're cutting it out based on the exact measurements so that it's ready to be installed. So the riser now has the first layer of OSB all over the top of it. So that's the technique. There's an air gap above the insulation as well, and that's all going to be about the design of trying to get the bass sound so that it can absorb as much into that space as possible. And thanks to everyone that's been subscribing through this series. I really appreciate it. And it certainly helps me want to make more videos in this series. So if you haven't already, throw a like on the video. And if you want to leave a comment or a question, I'll do my best to answer it for you. And now you can see the front section of that riser has had some holes cut really just to feed the power through of where the GPOs are going to be located. So everything's now aligning up to final positions. Still only one layer of OSB on there. And there's some power on the side to the step, which is going to be for a step light. And spoiler, that was probably one of the mistakes where it didn't really have the impact that I wanted to do, and I ended up changing how to get a little bit of motion sensor lighting in that, which is actually better. But being able to walk through from the top of the riser into that back section now at one level, you can really start to get a feel of like how that's going to be in actually just accessing that room. And that worked really well, but there's still a drop off to the lower part of it which we still need to deal with. And even back in the AV room, and this is another thing crazy that I did, may make no difference, but in the little walkway in that space, we've taken the height of the flooring up to the same level as the top of the riser, but I also did insulation in that room, again with 2 layers of it. And again, all the green string lines, holding it all, suspending it off the ground, and that little tiny space was so difficult to work in. There's no solid floor to stand on, and you're going to have to get all the staple gun into really awkward sort of positions. So glad when that was finished, but again, another one where most people wouldn't go to that extreme, and I wouldn't blame them. There is a little step down in the AV room where the last sort of half of the room is another step down. I did that, I think, just to give myself more room to be able to store things into a little storage shelving unit, which I built and put into there, which will be in a later video. I'll show you how I did that. And again, along this wall here, all of my movie storage is going to be built into that wall as well. It's a tight sort of space, but one which adds every bit of storage into the cinema so that anything that's needed is kept there, and there's nothing with clutter kept in the cinema room itself. So there's one layer of OSB that's been installed, but now we've rolled out the mass-loaded vinyl, the MLV. It's about a 3mm vinyl from memory. It's very, very dense, and a roll of it is enormously heavy. And once the roll of that goes down, we then secure it to the OSB. And here's the rolls of the MLV. It's relatively easy to work with. It's easy to just cut with a Stanley knife or box cutter. And here I've got a roll I'm just taking out and laying it down into the final spot where it's going to be installed. We'll have to cut around those stairs on either side. And the mass-loaded vinyl was quite expensive, what I used. So I made sure any offcuts I held on to, because later on you're going to see where I started jamming them into locations where I've then provided another gap off the floor when we started installing things up against the wall, or where I've used some parts of it into the hush box later on as well. Now the next layer of OSB has gone down, and what you can see here is there's again layers of the acoustic sealant which has been put on all of the gaps in the boards. And we're going to do this because we're just going to try to prevent sound leakage anywhere through and causing vibrations. This is the floor vents. So I bought the floor vents just off Amazon. There's 3 layers of OSB on here, and you can see there in that cutoff, the vinyl is above the first one, and then the OSB is on top of that, and then there's green glue on top of that, and then the 3rd layer of OSB. So if you think about it, there's 3 solid layers of OSB on the top of this riser. Again, is that overkill, or is that just really good technique for managing sound? You can judge yourself, but that's what I did on mine. And doing that means it's so heavy and dense that you don't get any sort of reverberation when you walk across the riser at all. There's no hollow sound, there's nothing. It's just absolute quiet. Cutting through the 3 layers to install the vents was enormously difficult, I will say. We used a circular saw as much as possible, and then just a little oscillating tool to create the right angle corners, but that was very difficult because you're also cutting through the MLV layer as well. And from memory, there's at least 6 or 7 of those vents that I used in the back. And you notice here I've got the walls painted, so we have skipped forward quite a bit ahead of time. I mentioned before, this video covers all the way up through to day 161 of construction. And at this point, we've also got the door jams being installed. This is the entry into the room now. The door jam is getting ready for installation. And I left the door jams to the carpenter. That's his bread and butter, and he's excellent at doing all that sort of work. Now I'm working back outside, and I'm doing the front sections of the riser. So I need to cover the width of the room, and I'm doing it in ply, and you'll see I'm going to cut it all to size, install it, and then drill holes in it to allow sound to pass through. And marking all the cutouts for where the stud locations are going to be, so I know where I can drill the holes and which areas to leave because there's a joist straight behind it. So the design here is basically to drill as many holes as possible in this ply, so it's going to allow sound to absorb into the riser. That's the idea of it. And I've got a Forstner bit here, and I'm just going to drill, it's a couple of 100 holes into that ply. And that was pretty slow going, I'm not going to lie. So here's one row that's done on one of the boards, and we're going to do 3 rows across the front. So we've made a lot more progress now. Forstner bit I think was getting a bit blunt by this stage, but we are now on the home stretch. So there you see the end result of how much air is potential to pass through that board through all the holes. And taking it downstairs, putting it into place. It's not particularly thick ply, I think it might have been 12 mil. I've got all my cutouts for where the power and GPOs are going to be located. And you see the cross section there, the insulation immediately behind where some of those holes are. The holes only run across the top half because on the bottom is the floor joist, so there's nothing that it can allow to pass through past that stage. There's lots of cutouts involved in this. It was very messy, just having to cut out for the GPOs, cutting out for around the U-boats on the floor, and just having everything to line up properly. So this is pretty much day 161 at this stage. And now you see there's a door for the AV rack room, and the rack has now made its first appearance. There'll be a whole new video coming up later on about how I did the rack. And overall, I was really happy with how that idea about the holes in the front of the riser turned out. There's going to be carpet in front of that as well, so the carpet will allow sound to travel through. You can see here clearly on the step to the left where you can still see where that MLV layer is poking out between the 3 layers of OSB. And all the edges have been rounded over with a router because we need to be able to roll the carpet over that edge as well. So a final look at the finished riser. It's pretty much ready for carpet at this stage. And the room's had a portion of the painting done, not all of it, but parts of it. And at this stage, the riser is now pretty much done, ready for carpet. And some detail here about the step. So all of the areas around that step has been sealed off with the acoustic sealant, and all the edges have been rounded over to allow for the carpet to roll as well. Cutouts in place around everything, and I was pretty happy with how all that turned out. And the whole front of the riser with all the holes in it, that was not an original design that I had planned. I did that along the way when we were constructing to think, how was I going to finish that edge? Because I hadn't really resolved that while we were constructing it. Hence, I went back quite a bit later into the build and added that afterwards. I still hadn't worked out how that front was going to be, and then I picked up on the idea of using that as a way to allow some of the movement of bass waves into the riser in particular. So we paused there at day 161. The next video, and you're going to want to see this one, is the pre-wire. I'm going to go through all the stages of how the room was wired, both by my AV specialist as well as the electrician. And that's going to start back, all the way back to day 19. So we're traveling back to see how that was done. Thanks for watching the series so far. Subscribe, don't miss out the next episode. I'll see you there. Pre-wires coming up. 1 week.